Welcome to this beginner's step-by-step watercolour tutorial where no drawing is required. I'll be painting an atmospheric cloudy sky, some reflections, a white sail and a gorgeous textured foreground. Let's get started. I'm using rough watercolour paper 14 by 10 inches. I've used some framing tape to tape round the edge and I'm using a grey board to rest it on. And for a full list of all the colours I'm using, materials, etc., please see the description below. So no drawing required, but I am actually putting in the horizon line using framing tape. You can use masking fluid or washi tape. Just make sure you test your paper out first to make sure it doesn't tear with the tape. Otherwise, draw a simple line with an HB pencil about a third up from the bottom. If you're using the tape, just press the top side of the tape, lift up the bottom side so you don't have the whole tape stuck to the paper. This kind of minimises the tearing process, but I will show you another way of stopping your tape from tearing your paper later in this tutorial. So no drawing still. So what I'm doing now is I am wetting the sky. I'm soaking it with a large flat brush. Really soak it. And I'm actually using my framing tape to tilt my painting so it gets the paint really flowing really nicely. If you notice, I don't have a reference photograph. I'm painting this from my imagination so I can really let go and not have to worry about the photograph. I'm mixing up a puddle of deep scarlet. You can use any red or a light red even, or Indian red. There's lots of alternatives and you can stick to something like this. I'm using a little bit of burnt sienna there. I'm now using yellow ochre. You can use raw sienna. So there's lots of earthy warm colours to start off with. This is a little bit of ultramarine mixed with a touch of that scarlet. Again, you can use the burnt sienna for this if you don't have the scarlet. I'm using some ultramarine now on its own. So have all your colours mixed beforehand and make sure there's plenty of it so you don't have to keep mixing while you're painting. So I'm starting off with the lightest colour first using my size 10 round brush. Don't worry if you've got little dry areas of the painting, it adds a little bit of light texture as well. So I'm sort of covering this and using the scarlet here towards the top, allowing gaps in between as well, painting wet into wet. So you can have fun here. And if it goes wrong, just put it under the tap and wash off so it takes the pressure off. So I'm now using the ultramarine mixed with the scarlet here and just applying this quite freely, wet into wet. And I am painting as fast as this, just because I like to just get on with it, you know, really paint it. If you find your painting is drying too quickly, just spritz it with a spritzer bottle. So I've gone in with the ultramarine here. I'm tilting as well myself. It's literally 90 degrees angle to get that paint moving, that lovely blue ultramarine paint running into those other colours there to create a wonderful atmospheric sky. Rinse my brush there, just took off the puddle at the bottom there. Mixing up a creamier wash now, the burnt sienna and the ultramarine, just paint some darker skies. Now you might want to leave the sort of lovely, sort of brighter sort of sky that I've just painted. But if you want to paint some shadows, make sure they're a little bit thicker, creamier, so they don't blend too much into that kind of wet underpainting. It stays a little bit more, it doesn't run too much, even though I am tilting to kind of get that paint flowing, make it look a little bit more atmospheric. And as you saw there, I'm using a clean damp brush to pick off any puddles at the edges. So I'm mixing up now some ultramarine with a little bit of burnt sienna to paint some shadows in the clouds. Now you can leave the painting at this stage before if you want to, especially if you're starting out as a beginner. This paint isn't as wet, it won't run as much, it will stay put. And I'm painting damp into wet with my size 10 brush. I'm also tilting here. As you can see, when you tilt, there's little puddles that collect at the bottom and you may want to just deal with those so they don't become cauliflowers later, because wet paint into damp paint sooner or later creates a cauliflower edge. What I'm doing here is I'm using my spritzer bottle just to get that paint moving a little bit more. There was a couple of marks there that were almost the paint's too damp and it won't sort of blend and flow. So a fine mist with a spritzer bottle really helps. And as you saw again, I collected a puddle. Just keep an eye on those puddles. Mixing up some ultramarine here with the Scarlet. You can carry on with the burnt sienna if you like. Painting now damp into damp, so these clouds really stay there. So with the perspective, the clouds at the top are bigger and slightly darker. As they go towards the horizon, they get smaller and paler. So as you can see here, I'm painting them smaller and the gaps between them become smaller. And this will create the illusion of space. So these clouds will look much further away, creating depth in my painting. So my 2D surface looks more 3D. So I'm using the side of my brush as well, the belly, and the paint flows less out of that. So you don't have to worry about a big puddle going onto your painting. You can also use a paper towel to do that, to control the amount of paint that goes on your paper. Using a little bit now, creamier, darker ultramarine, pinch of burnt sienna. So about 70% ultramarine, about 30% burnt sienna, and just painting some darks here and there. I'm mixing up here some ultramarine and the Scarlet, and I'm just painting some really small clouds with the tip of my brush, really pale, so they look miles away. You can swap to a smaller brush if it feels more comfortable. This is damp into damp. If the paper has lost its shine, either stop painting or spritz it with your spritzer bottle and just let it dry, and you can always go back, wet the paper carefully, and then add those paler marks. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry. I'm going to paint the hills. I'm mixing up some cadmium yellow, and I'm going to add a touch of yellow ochre to that. You can use raw sienna or even a pinch of red. I'm mixing up here some quinacridone gold, but you could continue on using raw sienna or yellow ochre. And I'm adding a touch of cobalt blue. You can use ultramarine to both of those yellows. And I'm painting wet on dry with my size 8 brush. And I'm sort of having a little bit of a dry brush there and getting sort of quite a nice textured sort of marks at the top there, and varying my marks. If you notice, the middle part, the hills are lower, and those sort of two sort of left and right hills are leading your eye into the painting, those diagonals. I'm sort of using these as a kind of compositional tool to tell a story, really, to get the viewer to look into my painting. Mixing up a little bit more thicker green now, using that blue and a touch of the yellow, and painting this damp into wet at the top, really hugging that paint, and doing the same on the right hand side. Lovely loose marks. Mixing up some ultramarine now. You can stick to the cobalt blue, and I'm actually mixing burnt sienna with it. Have you noticed it's not as puddly, it's creamier. Painting this more at the sort of bottom of the hills here, but a little bit at the top as well. If you notice at the bottom, it's slightly darker, bigger. At the top, slightly paler and smaller, so it looks further away. And I'm doing the same on the left hand side here, pushing those darks at the top. And what that does, it pulls away from that lovely atmospheric sky, and it kind of creates that illusion of depth as these sort of darker tonal values come forward. And you can have a little bit of fun with this. The only thing I would say is don't sort of linger too long. Paint what you need to do, and then come out, maybe mix some more colours, slightly creamier, and then add that. Don't keep going back and forth, because it might end up looking a little bit muddy, and you don't want to lose the light. So I'm making sure I've left lots of yellow light there as well. But if you have lost your light, I will show you how you can get it back shortly. Added a little bit more burnt sienna to the left there. Really creamy colour here. Burnt sienna, quinacridone gold, and some Paynes grey, really dark, just at the bottom there. So it really does create depth in your painting. So I've started off wet in wet, damp into wet, and then damp into damp. So I'm actually adding a little bit of that Scarlet there, but you could actually use burnt sienna there, or even some red mixed with burnt sienna to create a bit of warmth, more towards the centre as well, just towards the bottom. I'll leave it up to you, just have fun with it. I'm tilting now to get the paint flowing a little bit, so it creates the look of texture of foliage and bushes, etc. tops of trees. So I am mixing up a little bit of creamy yellow now, and that's for those of you that may have lost your light. So if you make it literally straight from the tube, painting it damp into damp, you can get some of that light. And I'm adding a little bit more dark here. You can use burnt sienna and ultramarine, just using the tip of my brush to create a little bit more interest and detail in those distant hills. Using a little bit more yellow straight from the tube, painting damp into damp, a little bit more light there on the left hand side and a touch more in the centre, so you can see it gets back that light. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. Once the painting is dry, I'm actually blow drying the framing tape, and this is to soften the glue, to take the tape off so it doesn't tear your paper. Now I can't promise it's still not going to tear your paper. Some papers just don't like tape, but in this instant my Saunders Waterford is okay. So I'm using my big brush again to wet the water area. It's slightly contaminated, but don't worry about that. And I'm using some of the sky colour, so that's the ultramarine. You can use a touch of the burnt sienna or the scarlet, or Indian red or light red. And the paint, as you can see, isn't too puddly. And I'm just making sure there's more dark at the bottom. I'm using a flat 1-inch brush and just really freely painting here. And I'm really using the colours of the sky to reflect the sky in the water, keeping it really simple. What I am going to do is just at the horizon line where the land meets the water, I'm going to keep that white. So there's like a lovely light at the top there. So I'm not going to paint right up to the land. Plus, it stops me from sort of touching the land and maybe disturbing it, because watercolour isn't permanent and you can disturb it if you make sort of brisk brush strokes. So using some of the scarlet, a little bit of the ultramarine here, you can use a touch of Paynes grey even. And as you can see, there's hardly any water in that. The moisture I'm getting is from the actual damp paper surface. I'm leaving gaps as well to represent the clouds as well, and it leaves white and light in your water. You don't want to lose the light, so less is more. Mixing up here a touch of that Paynes grey and yellow ochre, I think, maybe a touch of green. I want to kind of represent the land, a reflection of the land. Hardly have any paint on your brush and paint damp into damp. Don't have too much water, it will run too much. So just in case, wipe it off on a paper towel. I've added a touch of yellow in there just to represent the sort of more yellowy sort of colour in the middle of the hills there, and painting damp into damp with big broad brush strokes, making them a little bit sort of higher left and right. So it's not a mirror reflection, but it's kind of reflecting the land and the hills. So I am mixing up some ultramarine here with quinacridone gold. Again, not much water. And I'm painting just damp into damp to the sides here, leaving that white gap between the land and the water, and painting damp into damp, just a little bit more dark left and right, touch in the middle to represent the dark just at the bottom of the land there, and just blending through at the side of my 1-inch brush. I'm mixing up here some yellow and yellow ochre, lovely bright colour, and I just want to paint that damp into damp just in the centre to represent the reflection of the lovely yellow colour of the land. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. This is the fun bit. I'm mixing up with my 1-inch brush. I'm very loosened up here. Some yellow and some blue, a little bit of Prussian or Phthalo blue to make some bright green that comes forward, creates depth. And I'm just sort of painting this very freely in this left hand corner. You could paint this in the right hand corner if you wanted to. Use your imagination, have fun with it. I've used a little bit more yellow ochre. You can use quinacridone gold. If you notice, I sort of scrubbed at the top there to create sort of the look of foliage there, sort of dry brush on the water, really letting my brush sort of dance on that dry paper. Mixing up some quinacridone gold here with the ultramarine, you get a wonderful green, and really apply that thick creamy paint and let your brush dance to create these sort of really quite abstract marks. And I'm using a smaller brush now, you'll be relieved to hear, using the quinacridone gold. and mixing it again with the ultramarine, more ultramarine this time, to paint darker washes there, creamy dark washes, damp into damp, right in the corner. So that really pulls away from the distance as well, creates depth. So if you notice, I work sort of lighter to dark, even here. Watercolour, we work light to dark. Obviously, there's always exceptions. Using the tip of my brush now to paint sort of smaller leaves and foliage there. Creamier colour now, using burnt sienna and the quinacridone gold, even darker, creamier paint to pull forward to create depth, using the tip and the whole of my brush as well. You might even want to practice this on a rough piece of paper. It warms you up and gives you more confidence. I'm adding Paynes grey now, a little bit of burnt sienna, maybe some quinacridone gold, just painting these darks and details. Some of the areas are dry as well because I'm painting into the water that is dry. And this just creates all of that yummy detail, using the tip of my brush to paint tiny little marks here and there to represent different sort of plants, etc. Completely from my imagination, of course. But I loved painting like this because it does free you up. You can keep it quite abstract as well, or more representational by adding more details. But just flicking up with my brush every now and again, loading it. And I'm actually now spattering. You might want to cover your sky and water. I've been spattering for years, so I somehow don't seem to spatter where I don't want it. But I would say if you're starting out, do cover the essential areas, sky, land and water. Mixing up an even darker colour here with the grasses, painting damp into damp, just when you thought I couldn't get any darker. You can paint these wet on dry if you wish later on, if you don't want to continue painting damp into damp. The thing is, once the shine goes, you should stop painting because sometimes you introduce too much moisture and there is a danger of getting back runs. So instead of painting any more darks, I'm actually spattering now with some creamy yellow paint. It's literally straight from the tube with a little bit of water just to make it easier to spatter. You can spatter with a toothbrush as well, but they look like lovely yellow wildflowers. So I'm using my plastic card. It's an old bank card that I've cut up, and I'm lifting off some of that dark paint there. So you've got dark against light. That really pulls the foreground forward because you've got that detail. Now don't do this until the sort of shine is almost gone. You want the sheen there, but you don't want it too wet because the paint just runs back in on itself. But it really does create some lovely light leaves and stems, etc. So I've squeezed out some white gouache. You can use white watercolour or white acrylic, and I am spattering again. Mask out your sky if you need to, but again it looks like lovely white wild flowers and really adds white and light to the foreground as well. I'm using my size 8 round brush. And I think it's a good time now to allow the painting to thoroughly dry. And I'm removing the framing tape. And remember, you can use a hairdryer to soften the glue. So here is the painting, and you could leave it here, but I've also got something quite nice that you could do to add a little bit more interest in your painting and almost like a focal point. So I'm using the framing tape again, and remember your painting must be thoroughly dry. I'm making a little triangle, and it's going to represent a white sail. What I'm doing is I'm using my little eradicator brush here. You can find a link for this in the description, and lifting off. Watercolour does come off. Sometimes with staining colours it can be a little bit tricky, but these colours are coming off nicely. You can use a synthetic brush as well, or an old watercolour brush, or even a bristle brush, and use the paper towel to take off any moisture as well. And you may need to do this a few times and use plenty of clean water as well in each stage and lift off. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. And I'm going to take the framing tape off. As you can see, you've got a lovely sort of triangle shape, almost like a white sail. So I'm actually going to do the reflection now. So I'm doing the same thing on dry paper, lifting off with my eradicator brush. And again, removing the tape carefully. Use the hairdryer, remember, to stop the paper from tearing. And I'm going to work at it now with the eradicator brush. Again, you can use a synthetic brush just to lift off a bit more in the water, so it gives the illusion of reflection and even movement in the water. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. So I am mixing up here some cobalt blue, you can use ultramarine, with some yellow. And I'm just painting with the tip of my size 8 round brush, wet on dry. A little bit of reflection in the water, and now I've mixed up some burnt sienna and ultramarine just to paint the bottom of the boat there, just to give it a little bit of structure, and again allow my painting to dry. I'm using the white gouache straight from the tube, using my size 8 brush, you can use a smaller brush, painting wet on dry, some lighter reflections in the water to finish my painting. And here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section. And if you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel where you'll get updates of my latest tutorials. And if you'd like to get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.